Marcus Chen had always been good with his hands. Back on Earth, he'd fixed everything from broken spacecraft engines to delicate research equipment. Now, 3 months into humanity's first diplomatic mission to the Kithara homeworld, he was the go-to maintenance specialist for the embassy compound. It wasn't glamorous work, but someone had to keep the life support systems running while the ambassadors argued about trade agreements. The Kithara were impressive, no question about it. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, with muscular builds that made professional athletes look weak, they moved with a predator's grace that reminded Marcus of the big cats he'd seen in documentaries. Their golden eyes missed nothing, and their retractable claws could slice through steel plating like paper. They dominated their homeworld for millions of years, conquered 3 neighboring star systems, and built a civilization that spanned dozens of worlds. Humanity, by comparison, was barely out of their own solar system. The first contact had happened only 2 years ago, when human exploration vessels stumbled across a Kithara border patrol. Most species would have been enslaved or destroyed. But something about humans had intrigued the Kithara enough to open diplomatic channels instead of simply wiping them out. Marcus still wasn't sure what that something was. The Kithara were polite enough during formal meetings, but he could see the way they looked at humans, like adults watching children play with toys they didn't understand. Curious, maybe even amused, but not particularly impressed. That afternoon, Marcus was crawling through the maintenance tunnels beneath the embassy, replacing corroded power couplings that connected the human quarters to the main Kithara power grid. The tunnels were cramped and hot, barely wide enough for his shoulders. But the work was familiar and soothing. He'd always found peace in fixing things, in taking broken systems and making them whole again. He was deep in concentration, carefully aligning a particularly stubborn coupling when he heard it. A soft whimpering sound, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. Marcus froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from somewhere ahead in the tunnel system. Following the sound, Marcus crawled forward through a junction he'd never explored before. The whimpering grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like tiny scratching noises. As he rounded a corner, his headlamp illuminated a small alcove where several large pipes converged. And there, huddled together in a nest made of torn insulation and debris, were 3 of the most adorable creatures Marcus had ever seen. They were clearly Kithara, but tiny, no bigger than house cats. Their golden fur was fluffy and soft-looking, marked with the distinctive dark stripes that would become more prominent as they matured. Their eyes, still the brilliant gold of their species, were large and round with the vulnerability of very young animals. One of them, smaller than the others, was making the whimpering sounds Marcus had heard. Kithara cubs. Babies. And they were alone, hidden away in the maintenance tunnels beneath the embassy. Marcus's first instinct was to back away immediately. The Kithara were fiercely protective of their young, and being found with someone else's children would probably be interpreted as either theft or attempted harm. But as he started to retreat, the smallest cub made another pitiful whimpering sound, and he could see that it was shivering. The temperature in the tunnels was comfortable for humans, but these cubs were clearly cold. Their nest was makeshift and insufficient, and Marcus could see that they'd been trying to huddle together for warmth. How long had they been here? And where were their parents? Against his better judgment, Marcus moved closer. The cubs noticed him immediately, their large eyes fixing on his headlamp with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The 2 larger ones positioned themselves protectively in front of their smaller sibling, tiny growls rumbling in their chests. But they didn't run, which suggested they were either too weak to move quickly or had been hiding here long enough to become desperate. "Hey there, little ones," Marcus said softly, keeping his voice low and calm. He'd learned a few words of the Kithara language during his time at the embassy, but decided that English would be less threatening since they probably couldn't understand either anyway. "What are you doing down here?" The cubs watched him warily, but their aggressive postures relaxed slightly. Marcus noticed that their golden fur looked dull, and their movements seemed sluggish. When was the last time they'd eaten or had water? Marcus knew he should report this immediately. The proper procedure would be to contact the embassy security team who would then notify the Kythera authorities. The cubs would be returned to their families, assuming they had families to return to, and Marcus would have done his civic duty. But something about the sight of the three small creatures, alone and frightened in the dark tunnels, made him hesitate. The smallest one was still shivering, and Marcus could see that its breathing was shallow and rapid. Whatever had led to them being here, they needed help now, not after a lengthy bureaucratic process. Moving very slowly, Marcus reached into his tool bag and pulled out his emergency ration pack. The high-energy bars weren't exactly ideal for alien physiology, but they contained proteins and nutrients that might help. He broke off a small piece and held it out toward the cubs. The two larger ones sniffed suspiciously, but the smallest cub's hunger overcame its caution. It crept forward on unsteady legs and delicately took the food from Marcus's fingers. Its tiny fangs, barely developed, couldn't quite handle the texture of the ration bar, so Marcus softened it with a few drops of water from his canteen. Watching the small creature eat with desperate hunger, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. These weren't the terrifying predators he'd seen in the embassy meetings. They were just babies, scared and alone, and trying to survive. The other two cubs, seeing their sibling eat without being harmed, cautiously approached and accepted food as well. Marcus found himself smiling as they ate, their tiny tails twitching with what might have been pleasure at the unfamiliar taste. "Where did you come from?" he murmured, watching them eat. "And where are your parents?" He knew he couldn't leave them here. The tunnels were no place for young animals, and they were clearly struggling to survive on their own. But he also couldn't just march into the embassy carrying 3 Kythera cubs without expecting some serious consequences. Marcus considered his options while the cubs finished eating. His quarters were in the human section of the embassy, separate from the main Kythera areas. If he could get them there safely, he could at least provide proper food and warmth while he figured out what to do next. It wasn't exactly following protocol, but these cubs needed immediate help. The decision made, Marcus carefully gathered the cubs into his arms. They were surprisingly light, their bones feeling delicate despite their predatory heritage. The smallest one immediately snuggled against his chest, apparently seeking warmth, while the other two remained alert but didn't struggle. Getting back through the maintenance tunnels while carrying 3 alien cubs was more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. He had to move slowly and carefully, making sure not to bump them against the tunnel walls or squeeze them too tightly. The cubs seemed to understand that he was helping them, remaining quiet and still during the journey. Marcus's quarters were modest but comfortable, designed to accommodate human needs while fitting into the embassy's overall architecture. He'd managed to make it feel somewhat like home with personal items from Earth and plants that reminded him of his apartment back in New Tokyo. Once inside, Marcus set the cubs down on his bed and really got his first good look at them. They were beautiful, with the elegant bone structure that would make them formidable predators as adults, but softened by youth and fluffy fur. Their markings were intricate and unique, like fingerprints made of gold and shadow. The smallest cub, which Marcus had started thinking of as the runt, was clearly the weakest of the 3. Its breathing was still labored, and it seemed to have difficulty standing for long periods. The other 2, while larger and stronger, showed signs of prolonged hunger and stress. Marcus activated his computer terminal and began researching Kythera biology and nutrition. The embassy database had extensive information about the species, including dietary requirements and basic physiology. Cubs, he learned, required frequent feeding with high-protein foods, consistent warmth, and social interaction for proper development. He replicated some basic proteins using the food synthesizer in his quarters, adjusting the composition based on what he'd learned about Kythera nutritional needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than emergency rations. The cubs ate eagerly, their strength visibly improving with proper nutrition. The warmth problem was easier to solve. Marcus adjusted his quarters' temperature controls and gathered extra blankets to create a comfortable nest area. The cubs immediately gravitated toward the warm spots, finally able to stop shivering and relax. But it was what happened next that truly surprised Marcus. As he sat on the floor near their makeshift nest, watching to make sure they were comfortable, the smallest cub approached him. Instead of maintaining the cautious distance that Marcus expected, the tiny creature climbed directly onto his lap and then, with surprising determination, scrambled up his chest until it could curl up against his shoulder. Marcus froze, hardly daring to breathe. The cub was so small and warm against his neck, its tiny purr vibrating through his chest. Within minutes, the other two cubs had joined their sibling, climbing onto Marcus like he was a particularly comfortable piece of furniture. Soon all three cubs were fast asleep, draped across Marcus's chest and shoulders like the world's most dangerous stuffed animals. Their purring filled the room with a sound like distant thunder, and Marcus found himself relaxing despite the surreal nature of the situation. He'd expected them to be afraid of him, to maintain their distance while accepting his help. Instead, they seemed to view him as some kind of surrogate parent figure, seeking not just food and warmth but comfort and security. Marcus remained motionless for over an hour, letting the cubs sleep undisturbed. During that time, he tried to process what this meant. These weren't just any alien cubs, they were Kythera, members of a species that prided itself on strength and independence. Yet here they were, three babies who had somehow ended up alone and frightened, now sleeping peacefully on a human they'd met only hours ago. The implications were staggering. If word got out that Kythera cubs had sought refuge with a human, how would the adult Kythera react? Would they see it as a sign of weakness in their offspring? Or would they view Marcus as some kind of threat? As the cubs slept, Marcus noticed something else. Their breathing had become steady and deep, no longer the shallow, rapid pattern of stress and fear. Their fur seemed brighter, and the smallest one had stopped the occasional whimpering that had first drawn Marcus to them. Whatever was happening here, it was working. The cubs felt safe with him, safe enough to sleep soundly for what might be the first time in days or weeks. Marcus couldn't explain why, but he felt a fierce protective instinct awakening in his chest. These cubs had chosen to trust him, and he wouldn't betray that trust. The question now was what to do next. He couldn't keep three Kythera cubs hidden in his quarters indefinitely, and he couldn't abandon them to fend for themselves in the maintenance tunnels. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than three lost babies. Where were their parents? How had they ended up in the embassy tunnels? And why had they been alone long enough to become so desperate for food and warmth? As Marcus sat there with three alien predators sleeping trustfully on his chest, he realized that he might have stumbled into something much bigger than a simple rescue operation. The cubs' presence here, in the human embassy, couldn't be a coincidence. Whatever was going on, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to these cubs. They had trusted him with their lives, and he would protect them no matter what consequences that might bring. The soft purring continued as the cubs slept, and Marcus found himself making quiet promises to the sleeping forms on his chest. He would keep them safe, he would find out what had happened to their parents, and he would make sure they never had to huddle alone in the dark again. Outside his quarters, the embassy continued its normal operations, diplomats and staff going about their duties unaware that three of the galaxy's most formidable predators were taking their first peaceful rest in who knows how long, cradled in the arms of a human maintenance worker who had just made a decision that would change everything. Marcus woke up 6 hours later with a crick in his neck, and three warm bodies still nestled against him. He'd fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, not wanting to disturb the cubs who had claimed him as their temporary guardian. The smallest one, which he'd started calling Pip in his mind, was curled directly over his heart, while the other two had arranged themselves across his shoulders. He moved carefully, trying not to wake them, but Kythera's senses were sharp, even in the very young. All three cubs stirred as he shifted, their golden eyes opening to focus on his face. For a moment, Marcus worried they might have forgotten their trust from the night before, but instead of retreating, they stretched and yawned like oversized kittens. The sight was so endearing that Marcus almost forgot they would grow up to be 8-foot-tall apex predators capable of tearing through steel bulkheads. Almost. "Good morning, little ones," he whispered, gently stroking Pip's soft fur. The cub immediately began purring, a sound that seemed far too loud to come from such a small creature. "Are you hungry?" As if understanding his question, all three cubs perked up eagerly. Marcus carefully disentangled himself from their warm weight and moved to the food synthesizer. He'd spent part of the night researching Kythera nutritional requirements, and now he programmed a more sophisticated meal plan into the machine. The cubs watched intently as he prepared their breakfast, their small tails swishing with anticipation. When he set down the bowls, they attacked the food with enthusiasm that told Marcus just how hungry they'd been in the tunnels. While they ate, Marcus activated his computer terminal and began searching the embassy's communication logs. If 3 Kithara cubs had gone missing, there should be some record of it: search parties, worried parents, security alerts. But as he scrolled through the official channels, he found nothing. That was strange. The Kithara were intensely family-oriented, with strong pack bonds that lasted for life. The disappearance of 3 cubs should have triggered massive search efforts, not the complete silence Marcus was finding in the official records. He expanded his search to include personal communications and informal networks, being careful to avoid triggering any security protocols. Here, finally, he found traces of what he was looking for. Buried in the personal logs of embassy staff were mentions of increased Kithara security patrols, hushed conversations between officials, and a general sense of tension that hadn't been there a week ago. Something was definitely being covered up. Marcus was so absorbed in his research that he didn't notice one of the cubs approaching until a small paw tapped his leg. Looking down, he saw the middle-sized cub, the one he'd started thinking of as Scout, standing beside his chair with what appeared to be a questioning expression. "What is it, Scout?" Marcus asked softly. The cub made a small chittering sound and looked toward the door of Marcus's quarters, then back at him. After a moment, it became clear what Scout wanted: the cub needed to use the bathroom. This presented a new problem. Marcus couldn't exactly take 3 Kithara cubs for a walk around the embassy, but he also couldn't let them suffer. He activated his quarters' waste recycling system and quickly fashioned a makeshift litter area using materials from his maintenance supplies. Scout investigated the setup with typical feline curiosity before using it appropriately. The other 2 cubs followed suit when needed, showing an intelligence and adaptability that impressed Marcus. These weren't just intelligent animals, they were thinking beings, capable of problem-solving and communication even at their young age. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself falling deeper into an unexpected routine. The cubs required frequent feeding, but between meals they were surprisingly independent. They explored his quarters with careful thoroughness, investigating every corner and surface with the methodical approach of natural predators. What amazed Marcus most was how they interacted with him. Rather than maintaining the respectful distance he'd expected from such a hierarchical species, the cubs seemed to view him as part of their pack. They followed him around his quarters, sought him out for comfort when they were tired, and had developed a complex system of chirps and purrs to communicate their needs. Pip, the smallest, was clearly the most attached to him. The little cub rarely strayed far from Marcus's side and had taken to climbing onto his lap whenever he sat down. The other 2, Scout, and the largest, whom Marcus had named Guardian for its protective instincts toward its siblings, were more independent, but equally trusting. By midday, Marcus had made a disturbing discovery in the embassy's communication logs. 3 days ago, there had been an incident in the Kithara residential section. The official report was classified, but Marcus's maintenance clearance gave him access to the technical assessments that followed. There had been a fire. Not a major one, but significant enough to require evacuation of an entire residential block. Among the displaced families listed in the emergency response logs, Marcus found what he was looking for: the Thys family unit, consisting of 2 adults and 3 cubs. The parents were listed as casualties. The cubs were listed as missing. Marcus stared at the screen, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. These cubs weren't lost, they were orphans. Their parents had died in the fire, and somehow the cubs had escaped and hidden in the embassy's maintenance tunnels, surviving alone for 3 days before Marcus found them. But that raised even more questions. Why wasn't there a massive search for 3 orphaned cubs? In Kithara society, orphaned children were immediately taken in by other family units, or the community as a whole. The fact that these cubs had been left to survive on their own suggested something was very wrong with the official response. Marcus was still processing this information when his door chimed. His blood went cold. Someone was requesting entry to his quarters. The cubs, who had been napping peacefully on his bed, immediately came alert. their ears pricked forward and their bodies tense. "Mr. Chen." The voice belonged to Ambassador Harrison, the head of the human diplomatic mission. "I need to speak with you about a maintenance issue." Marcus looked at the cubs, who were now fully awake and watching the door with obvious concern. There was nowhere to hide them in his small quarters, and no way to smuggle them out without being seen. "Just a moment, Ambassador," Marcus called out, his mind racing. "I'm just finishing up something." He knelt beside the cubs and spoke to them in a low, urgent whisper. "Listen. You need to stay very quiet. Okay? Don't make any sounds." To his amazement, the cubs seemed to understand his tone, if not his words. They immediately moved to the furthest corner of the room and huddled together silently. Marcus took a deep breath and opened the door. Ambassador Harrison was a tall, severe-looking woman who had made her career in interspecies diplomacy. She stepped into Marcus's quarters with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. "Mr. Chen, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "The Kithara authorities have requested access to our maintenance tunnels. They claim there's been a security breach." Marcus forced himself to remain calm. "What kind of security breach?" "They won't say specifically, but they've implied that something of value has gone missing from their side of the embassy." Harrison's eyes narrowed as she studied Marcus's face. "You spend more time in those tunnels than anyone else. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Before Marcus could answer, a soft sound came from the corner of the room. It was barely audible, just the faintest purr, but in the silence of the quarters, it might as well have been a shout. Ambassador Harrison's head snapped toward the sound, her diplomatic training immediately putting her on high alert. "Mr. Chen, what was that?" Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. But before he could think of an explanation, something extraordinary happened. Pip, the smallest cub, stepped out from behind the corner where they'd been hiding. The tiny golden creature looked directly at Ambassador Harrison with those large, intelligent eyes, and then did something that Marcus would never have expected. It sat down politely, like a well-trained dog, and made a soft chittering sound that was clearly a greeting. Ambassador Harrison stared at the cub in absolute shock. "Mr. Chen, what in the hell is that doing in your quarters?" "Ambassador, I can explain," Marcus began, but Guardian and Scout had now emerged from hiding as well. Instead of appearing threatening or wild, all three cubs sat in a neat row, looking for all the world like they were waiting to be introduced. "These are Kithara cubs," Harrison said slowly, her voice carefully controlled. "3 Kithara cubs. In a human's quarters. Mr. Chen, do you have any idea what this could mean for our diplomatic mission?" Marcus took a deep breath. "They're orphans, Ambassador. Their parents died in a fire 3 days ago. I found them in the maintenance tunnels, starving and cold. And you brought them here? To your quarters?" Harrison's voice was rising despite her diplomatic training. "Mr. Chen, these are not stray cats. These are the children of a species that could crush our entire civilization if they chose to. What were you thinking?" Before Marcus could answer, something even more unexpected happened. Pip, apparently sensing the tension in the room, stood up and walked directly to Ambassador Harrison. The small cub looked up at the human authority figure and made a series of soft sounds that were clearly an attempt at communication. Then, to everyone's surprise, Pip gently reached out with one tiny paw and touched Harrison's hand. The ambassador stared down at the small creature, her anger visibly wavering. It's trying to communicate with me." "They're incredibly intelligent," Marcus said quietly. "More than I expected. And they seem to have bonded with humans in a way that I don't think anyone anticipated." Harrison knelt down slowly, bringing herself to the cub's eye level. Guardian and Scout approached her cautiously, but without fear. Within moments, all 3 cubs were investigating this new human, with curious sniffs and gentle touches. "This is unprecedented," Harrison murmured, watching as Scout climbed onto her knee to get a better look at her face. "Kithara cubs bonding with aliens? The xenobiologists are going to lose their minds." "There's more," Marcus said. "I think someone on the Kithara side doesn't want these cubs found. The search efforts have been practically non-existent, and the whole incident has been classified." Harrison looked up at him sharply. What do you mean? Marcus quickly explained what he'd discovered in the communication logs, the fire, the listed casualties, the missing cubs, and the suspicious lack of official search efforts. As he spoke, Harrison's expression grew increasingly grim. You're suggesting a cover-up, she said when he finished. I'm saying that 3 orphaned cubs were left to die in maintenance tunnels while their people claimed to be searching for them, Marcus replied. Draw your own conclusions. Ambassador Harrison stood slowly, her mind clearly working through the diplomatic implications. Mr. Chen, this situation is far more complex than either of us initially thought. These cubs may be more than just orphans, they may be political inconveniences that someone wanted to disappear. The cubs, meanwhile, had arranged themselves around the 2 humans like they belonged there. Pip had claimed a spot between Marcus's feet, while Scout and Guardian flanked Ambassador Harrison like tiny, fluffy bodyguards. The question now, Harrison continued, is what we do about it. We can't keep 3 Cathara cubs hidden indefinitely. But if we turn them over to the authorities who allowed them to disappear in the first place. We don't turn them over, Marcus said firmly. These cubs trust us. They've bonded with us in a way that apparently doesn't happen with their own species. That has to mean something. Harrison looked down at the 3 small creatures who had made themselves at home with the humans. You're right. The question is, how we handle this, without destroying our diplomatic relationship with the Cathara. As if in response to her words, Marcus's communication terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender was listed as High Counselor Vex Tar, the senior Cathara official at the embassy. Harrison and Marcus exchanged glances before Harrison activated the message. The holographic projection of a massive Cathara appeared in the room, its golden eyes cold and impatient. Ambassador Harrison, the alien's voice rumbled through the speakers. We require immediate access to your maintenance systems. Our security forces will begin their search within the hour. The message ended abruptly, leaving the humans staring at the empty space where the hologram had been. They're coming, Harrison said quietly. Marcus looked down at the 3 cubs, who were now looking up at the humans with what appeared to be understanding. Somehow, they seemed to know that their safety was in jeopardy. Then we need to make a choice, Marcus said. Do we hand them over to people who wanted them to disappear, or do we find another way? Ambassador Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the cubs who had arranged themselves trustfully around the humans. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Chen, I hope you're prepared for the consequences of what you've started. Because I don't think any of us are going back to the way things were before. Outside the quarters, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the embassy corridors. The Cathara security forces were mobilizing, and time was running out. In the corner of the room, 3 small golden creatures pressed closer to their human protectors, instinctively understanding that whatever happened next would determine their fate. The purring had stopped, replaced by alert silence, as the cubs prepared for whatever danger was approaching. Marcus reached down and gently stroked Pip's soft fur, feeling the cub's rapid heartbeat under his fingers. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't abandon these cubs to the fate that someone had planned for them. The real question was whether humanity was ready for what protecting these cubs might cost them. The footsteps in the corridor grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive click of Cathara claws on metal flooring. Ambassador Harrison moved quickly to her communication device, her fingers flying over the controls as she composed an urgent message to Earth Command. Whatever was about to happen, humanity needed to be prepared for the consequences. Marcus knelt beside the 3 cubs, who had instinctively huddled together at the sound of approaching danger. Their earlier playfulness had vanished, replaced by the alert wariness of their predatory heritage. But even now, in what might be their final moments together, they pressed close to him rather than hiding. It's going to be okay, Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. No matter what happens, you're not alone anymore. The door chime sounded, but this time it wasn't a request. The override codes had been activated, and the door slid open to reveal High Counselor Vex Tar, flanked by 4 Cathara security officers. Each of the aliens stood nearly 8 feet tall, their golden eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. But when those eyes fell upon the 3 cubs sitting calmly beside the humans, something extraordinary happened. The security officers froze in place, their expressions shifting from professional alertness to something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Shock? Recognition? Fear? High Counselor Vextar stepped into the room, his massive frame making the quarters feel suddenly cramped. His eyes never left the cubs as he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Ambassador Harrison, Mr. Chen, we have come to retrieve our missing property. Property? Marcus felt anger flare in his chest. These are children, not property. Vextar's golden eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that would have been terrifying under normal circumstances. You are a maintenance worker. You know nothing of Kithara law or custom. These cubs belong to our people. Then where were your people 3 days ago? Marcus shot back, rising to his feet. Where were they when these cubs were starving in your maintenance tunnels? Where were the search parties? Where was the concern for their welfare? Ambassador Harrison placed a warning hand on Marcus's arm, but he shook it off. The cubs had moved to stand between him and the Kithara officials, their small bodies tense but unafraid. They trusted him to protect them. And he wouldn't back down now. You dare question our methods? Vextar's voice carried a dangerous edge. You have interfered with Kithara internal affairs. You have stolen our young. These are acts of aggression. We saved them, Marcus replied firmly. Look at them, Counselor. Really look at them. When I found these cubs, they were dying. They were cold, hungry, and abandoned. Now look at them. As if to prove his point, Pip stepped forward and sat down directly between Marcus and the towering Kithara official. The small cub looked up at Vextar without flinching, then made a soft, chittering sound that Marcus had come to recognize as a greeting. Vextar stared down at the cub, and for a moment, his composed facade cracked. Something that might have been pain flickered across his features before the mask of authority slammed back into place. The cubs will be returned to proper Kithara care, he said stiffly. You will not interfere. But when one of the security officers stepped forward to collect the cubs, something unprecedented happened. All 3 cubs moved as one, positioning themselves in a protective formation around Marcus's legs. They didn't run or hide. They stood their ground, making it clear that they chose to stay with the human who had cared for them. The security officer hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. In all their training, nothing had prepared them for cubs who refused to come when called. Especially cubs who seemed to prefer alien caretakers over their own species. They don't want to go, Marcus said quietly. Doesn't that matter to you? Cubs do not make such decisions, Vextar replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. They are too young to understand what is best for them. Ambassador Harrison, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke. Counselor, perhaps we should discuss this situation more fully. It seems there are aspects of this incident that haven't been properly addressed. Vextar's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean that 3 cubs don't simply disappear from a fire scene without someone allowing it to happen, Harrison replied calmly. I mean that search efforts that mysteriously never materialized. I mean that certain parties might have had reasons for wanting these particular cubs to remain missing. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could see the security officers exchanging glances, their body language suggesting that Harrison had touched on something they knew but weren't supposed to discuss. You are making accusations without proof, Vextar said, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. Then let's examine the proof, Harrison said, activating her portable data display. Fire incident 3 days ago. 2 adult casualties listed as this family unit. 3 cubs listed as missing. But no search parties assigned. No emergency fostering arrangements made. No community support mobilized. In a species known for its intense family bonds, that's not just unusual, it's impossible. As Harrison spoke, Marcus noticed something happening with the cubs. Scout had moved to investigate one of the security officers, approaching with the fearless curiosity typical of the young, but instead of the professional detachment Marcus expected, the officer's demeanor softened noticeably. The alien's golden eyes tracked the cub's movements with something that looked very much like longing. Unless, Harrison continued, someone wanted these cubs to disappear. Someone who had reasons for not wanting them to survive to adulthood. Silence, Vextar commanded. but his authority was cracking. "You know nothing of our internal politics. I know that 3 orphaned cubs were left to die," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I know that they survived on their own for 3 days before I found them. And I know that in the time they've been with us, they've shown more trust and affection than they ever would have received from whoever wanted them gone." To emphasize his point, Marcus knelt down and gently scooped Pip into his arms. The smallest cub immediately snuggled against his chest, purring loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. Guardian and Scout pressed against his legs, making soft sounds of contentment. The effect on the Kithara was immediate and profound. The security officers stared at the scene with expressions of wonder and something that might have been envy. Even Vextar's composed mask slipped, revealing emotions too complex for Marcus to fully interpret. "This is not possible," one of the security officers whispered. "Cubs do not bond with aliens. They cannot." "And yet they have," Ambassador Harrison observed. "The question is why? What is it about human behavior that enabled this bond when their own people left them to die?" Marcus looked down at the 3 cubs who had claimed him as their protector. In the past 24 hours, he'd learned more about parenting than he'd ever expected to know. But it hadn't felt like a burden, it had felt natural, right, like something he was meant to do. "Maybe," Marcus said slowly. "It's because we didn't see them as problems to be solved, or political inconveniences to be removed. We saw them as children who needed care. Humans," he continued, addressing Vextar directly, "we're not the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the smartest, or the most advanced. But maybe there's something we do better than anyone else. Maybe we're better at caring for the vulnerable." As if to prove his point, Scout had convinced the security officer to kneel down, and was now investigating the alien's armor with intense curiosity. The officer, despite his training and professional demeanor, was gently allowing the cub to explore, his large hands hovering protectively near the small creature. Vextar watched this interaction with growing agitation. This is not how cubs should behave. They should show proper respect for authority, proper wariness of strangers. "They're showing proper trust in people who've proven worthy of it," Marcus replied. "Look at your officer, counselor. Tell me he doesn't want to protect that cub. Tell me his instincts aren't responding exactly the way they should to a young creature in need of care." The security officer in question looked up at Vextar with pleading eyes. "Counselor, the cubs appear healthy and well cared for. Perhaps the humans' methods, while unorthodox, have been effective." "Effective," Vextar repeated bitterly. "Yes, I can see how effective they've been. Cubs who should fear aliens instead trust them. Cubs who should look to their own kind for protection instead seek comfort from strangers. Cubs who should be dead are alive and thriving," Ambassador Harrison pointed out. "That seems like the most important measure of effectiveness." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but at that moment, Marcus's communication terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender code indicated it was from the highest levels of Kithara government. Vextar's expression went from agitated to panicked. "Do not answer that transmission." But Ambassador Harrison was already activating the display. The holographic projection that appeared was of an elderly Kithara female, her golden fur streaked with silver, and her eyes holding the weight of age and authority. "I am Elder Matriarch Zaresh," the figure announced. "I seek information regarding 3 cubs of the Thys lineage." The effect on the security team was immediate. All 4 officers snapped to attention, while Vextar looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Elder Matriarch," Harrison said respectfully, "the cubs are here and they are safe." "Show me," the matriarch commanded. Harrison adjusted the display so that Zaresh could see the entire room. The elder's eyes took in the scene, the 3 cubs positioned protectively around Marcus, the security officers clearly affected by the cubs' presence, and Vextar's obvious distress. "Counselor Vextar." The matriarch's voice carried the chill of deep space. "You reported these cubs as untraceable. Yet here they are, safe and healthy in the care of our human allies. Please explain this discrepancy." Vextar opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was written clearly across his face: guilt, shame, and the bitter knowledge that his deception had been exposed. The cubs were declared politically problematic, one of the security officers said suddenly, his voice heavy with shame. Their father had opposed certain council decisions. When the fire provided an opportunity, he couldn't finish the sentence. Elder Matriarch Zaresh's eyes blazed with fury. You attempted to eliminate cubs because of their father's political stance? You left children to die for the sake of convenience? The silence stretched on until Marcus spoke up. Elder Matriarch, with respect, none of that matters now. What matters is that these cubs are alive, and they deserve a future. The old matriarch's gaze fixed on Marcus, studying him with intense scrutiny. You are the human who found them? Yes, ma'am. And you cared for them despite knowing they are not of your species? They're children, Marcus said simply. That's all that mattered. Zaresh nodded slowly. Show me how they respond to you. Marcus knelt down and called softly to the cubs. All three immediately came to him, with Pip climbing into his arms while Guardian and Scout pressed against his sides. Their purring filled the room with sound that spoke of contentment and trust. The matriarch watched this display with growing wonder. In 800 years of life, I have never seen cubs bond so completely with an alien caretaker. This is unprecedented. They chose us, Marcus said quietly. When they were abandoned by their own people, they chose to trust humans instead. Maybe that should tell you something about what we're capable of. Elder Matriarch Zaresh was quiet for a long moment, studying the scene before her. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of momentous decision. Counselor Vextar, you and your co-conspirators will face judgment for your crimes against our most sacred laws. Children are the future of our species, and you attempted to murder that future for political gain. Vextar and his security team were visibly deflating under the matriarch's condemnation. As for these cubs, she continued, they have demonstrated something remarkable. They have shown that the bonds of family can transcend species, that care and protection can come from unexpected sources. Human Marcus Chen, you have done something no Kithara thought possible. You have earned the complete trust and affection of our young. Marcus looked up at the holographic figure. What does that mean for them? It means, the matriarch said with something that might have been a smile, that they will remain in your care until such time as you deem them ready for independence. The cubs have chosen their guardian, and we will honor that choice. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. You want me to raise them, all the way to adulthood? You have already proven yourself capable, Zaresh replied. And they have proven that they thrive under your care. This arrangement will also serve as an unprecedented opportunity for our species to learn from each other. Ambassador Harrison stepped forward. Elder Matriarch, this would require significant changes to our diplomatic arrangements. Indeed it would, and those changes will be made. A permanent human presence will be established on our home world, with full diplomatic status and protection. In return, we hope to learn more about these remarkable caring instincts that humans possess. Marcus looked down at the three cubs who had just changed the course of galactic diplomacy. Pip was looking up at him with those large golden eyes, as if asking whether he was ready for the adventure ahead. Well, little ones, Marcus said softly, it looks like we're going to be together for a long time. Are you okay with that? The purring that erupted from all three cubs was answer enough. Over the following months, as Marcus prepared for his new role as interspecies foster parent and unofficial ambassador, he often thought about that first moment in the maintenance tunnel when he'd heard soft whimpering in the dark. He'd been looking for broken machinery to fix, but instead, he'd found something far more valuable, 3 small lives that needed protection and care. The Kythara, despite their advanced technology and galactic dominance, had been willing to sacrifice their own young for political convenience. But humanity, barely out of their own solar system, had seen those same young as precious lives worth protecting at any cost. Maybe that was what made humans special in the galaxy, not their technology or their ambition, but their instinctive drive to care for the vulnerable, regardless of species or politics. As Marcus packed his belongings for the journey to the Kythera home world, 3 golden cubs supervised the process with typical feline attention to detail. They were no longer the frightened, starving creatures he'd found in the tunnels. They were healthy, happy, and secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. And in a galaxy where strength and technology often determined a species' worth, 3 small cubs had proven that sometimes the most powerful force of all was the simple act of caring for those who needed it most. The predator cubs had disappeared, only to be found napping on a human's chest. But what they'd really found was something the galaxy hadn't known. It needed a species that would choose compassion over convenience, protection over politics, and love over law. In the end, perhaps that was humanity's greatest weapon. Not their ingenuity or determination, but their unlimited capacity to care for others. And 3 small Kithera cubs would grow up as living proof that some bonds transcend species, politics, and even the vast emptiness of space itself.